There's a specific kind of silence that happens when a man realizes he's being destroyed and there's nothing he can do about it. Not the silence before a fight, not the silence of meditation or strategy, the silence of a trap closing. Mike Tyson sat in that silence for 4 minutes on national television, while 20 million people watched his wife explain why he was broken. His hands didn't move, his jaw was loose, and his eyes, those eyes that had made grown men quit before the first bell, went completely empty, like someone had unplugged something inside his skull and forgot to plug it back in. This was September 1988. Barbara Walters' studio in Manhattan. The leather chair was expensive, but it felt like sitting in a courtroom. Robin Givens sat to his left, close enough that their knees almost touched, but the distance between them could have been measured in continents. She wore cream, he wore black. The cameras had that hot white glare that makes everything feel overexposed, like a medical examination under fluorescent lights. Mike's suit was tailored, but his shoulders looked wrong in it, like he was wearing someone else's skin. The fabric pulled tight across his back when he breathed. His collar felt like it was strangling him, even though it wasn't tight. Everything about the setting was designed to make him feel civilized, contained, domesticated. Everything about Mike Tyson resisted civilization. 22 years old, undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, and he was about to experience the only knockout he never saw coming. Brownsville had taught Mike Tyson a specific mathematics of survival. If someone disrespects you, you hit them before they finish the sentence. If someone threatens you, you hit them before they move. If someone humiliates you, you hit them until the humiliation transfers to their face and they carry it instead of you. Simple equations, predictable outcomes. The streets had rules that made sense to Mike. Physical rules, territorial rules, rules written in broken noses and black eyes, and the way people crossed to the other side of Hegeman Avenue when they saw you coming. He'd learned those rules young, 7 years old, getting jumped for his glasses, 8 years old, watching his mother bring different men home who'd smack her around when the money ran out, 9 years old, discovering that if you hit first, hit hardest, and kept hitting until they stopped moving, people left you alone. By 11, he was robbing grown men at knife point. By 12, he'd been arrested 38 times. The system had labeled him incorrigible before he could spell the word, but Q's D'Amato saw something else. Saw the mathematics of violence in Mike's hands and thought, I can refine this, I can turn chaos into choreography. Q's D'Amato had refined this mathematics into something surgical. He'd taught Mike that controlled violence was an art form, that you could dismantle a man with precision instead of rage. That destruction, when properly calibrated, was beautiful. He'd also taught Mike something more dangerous, that the world outside the ring operated on different mathematics entirely, that there were people who'd smile at you while planning your destruction. That trust was a luxury that men like Mike couldn't afford. But then Kidus died, and in the 2 years since, Mike had forgotten that last lesson, had let himself believe that Robin was different, that love could be simple again, that he could trust someone the way he'd trusted Kidus. But Kudus had died 2 years ago, and nobody had taught Mike the mathematics of what to do when the violence had to stay inside, when your hands had to stay in your lap, when the person destroying you was doing it with words under television lights, and you couldn't even stand up without looking guilty. Robin Givens had studied different mathematics. She'd grown up in a world where power didn't come from your fists, it came from your positioning, your narrative, your ability to make people believe your version of events before anyone else spoke. She'd gone to Sarah Lawrence College. She spoke 3 languages. She understood that Mike Tyson, for all his violence, for all his money, for all his fame, was functionally illiterate in the language of psychological warfare. He could read a jab, he could read a feint, he couldn't read the way she'd been slowly building a case against him in public for months. The campaign had been methodical. First, the People magazine interview, where she'd cried about feeling trapped. Then the whispered conversations with columnists about Mike's mood swings. Then the leaked story about the car incident, details vague enough to be ominous, specific enough to sound credible. She'd appeared on talk shows, looking fragile, speaking in carefully constructed sentences that implied danger without making direct accusations. Each appearance built on the last. Each interview added another layer to the narrative. Robin Givens, the educated beauty, imprisoned by the violent, unstable champion. And America believed her, because the story fit. The beast and the beauty, the educated actress, and the street thug who'd gotten lucky. It confirmed what people already suspected about Mike Tyson. that underneath the suits and the money and the championship belts, he was still that kid from Brownsville, still dangerous, still uncontrollable, still one bad moment away from becoming exactly what everyone feared he'd always been. The interviews where she'd cry on cue, the leaked stories about his temper, the way she'd positioned herself as the beauty captured by the beast, and now the final move. Sit next to him on national television and explain his madness while he sat there, mute, proving her point with his silence. Barbara Walters asked the questions, but everyone knew who was really conducting the interview. Robin, you've described your life with Mike as, quote, torture, pure hell, worse than anything I could imagine. Can you elaborate? The studio felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Mike's breathing changed. Not faster, slower, the way a predator's breathing slows before it moves. But he didn't move. Robin leaned forward slightly, the gesture of someone about to share a painful truth. Barbara, I wake up every day not knowing which Mike I'm going to encounter. There's the Mike the public sees, the champion, the icon, and then there's the Mike I live with. The one who's manic, depressive, who swings from rage to despair within minutes. I'm living with someone who needs psychiatric help and refuses to get it. The words landed like body shots: manic, depressive, psychiatric help. In 1988, those weren't neutral clinical terms. They were career enders. They were the language used to describe people who got locked up, people who lost their money to conservators, people who couldn't be trusted with their own lives. Mike's lawyers had told him to stay silent. Let Robin talk, don't react. The worst thing you can do is lose your temper on camera and prove her right. So he sat there, his jaw working slightly, like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. His hands in his lap, fingers laced together so tight the knuckles were white. Barbara Walters turned to him. Mike, how do you respond to that? And for maybe 3 seconds, everyone watching thought he might actually answer, might defend himself, might explain. Instead, he looked at Robin, not at Barbara, at Robin, and Robin looked back with something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't not a smile either. And Mike said, she's right, I'm a bad guy sometimes. 4 words, confession without context, capitulation without fight. The studio audience couldn't see it, but in Mike's peripheral vision, he could see the camera operators exchanging glances, could feel the shift in the room, the understanding that they were witnessing something rare, not a fighter getting knocked down, a fighter staying down, choosing to stay down. Barbara Walters, professional that she was, knew exactly what this meant. Mike, when you say you're a bad guy sometimes, what does that mean specifically? She was giving him a chance to clarify, to push back, to add nuance. He didn't take it. I lose control, I scare her, I scare myself. What nobody in that studio understood was what was happening inside Mike Tyson's skull in those 4 minutes of silence. It wasn't surrender, it wasn't defeat, it was something worse. It was the recognition of absolute checkmate. Every move he could make would confirm Robin's narrative. If he defended himself, he was denying her experience, proving he was the gaslighting abuser she'd described. If he attacked her story, he was the volatile maniac she'd warned everyone about. If he stayed silent, he was the broken, disturbed man who couldn't even articulate his own defense. She'd created a scenario where his only option was to lose. And underneath that recognition, something else was happening. A kind of math he'd never had to do before. In the ring, you could feel the moment you were beat. Your legs went heavy, your arms stopped responding, your corner threw in the towel. There was a clarity to it, a finality. This was different. This was sitting in that expensive leather chair doing calculations in his head that all led to the same conclusion. He'd been set up from the beginning. Every intimate conversation, every moment of vulnerability, every time he'd told her about the nightmares, about feeling like nobody saw him as human, about the terror of losing control, all of it had been data collection, research, building the case she was now presenting to the world. Mike was thinking about the night he'd proposed, down on one knee in some expensive restaurant, hands shaking, asking this woman he barely knew to marry him because she made him feel like maybe he could be something other than a weapon. Thinking about how she'd said yes, but her eyes had gone to the ring first, calculating its value before she looked at his face. How he'd ignored that, chosen to ignore it, because he wanted so badly to believe someone could love him without wanting to use him. And the most dangerous part, the part that was actually breaking something inside him in real time, was that some of what she said was true. He did have a temper. He did swing between emotional extremes. He had scared her, not always, not even most of the time, but enough that she could weaponize those moments into a pattern, a diagnosis, a case for why she needed to leave and take half of everything with her. Cos D'Amato used to say that boxing was about controlling chaos. You created chaos in your opponent's mind and maintained perfect order in your own. Robin Givens had reverse-engineered this principle. She'd created chaos in Mike's mind while maintaining perfect composure on camera. Every question Barbara asked, Robin answered with precision, anecdotes that sounded devastating but were vague enough that they couldn't be disproven. There was an incident in the car where I thought I was going to die. No date, no details, just fear, implied violence. He's threatened me in ways I can't even describe. The refusal to describe was the description. Mike sat there absorbing it all, and with each accusation, each carefully worded suggestion of danger, something inside him was calcifying, not into rage, into something colder, into the understanding that love, or what he'd thought was love, could be used as a weapon more effective than anything he'd ever faced in a ring. The thing about psychological torture is that it's architectural. Physical pain ends. Broken bones heal. But when someone systematically destroys your credibility, your reputation, your understanding of your own reality, they're building a structure in your mind that you have to live in forever. Mike was watching that structure being built in real time. Barbara Walters asked, "Robin, do you still love him?" And Robin paused. The pause was the answer, but she gave one anyway. "I love who I thought he was. I don't know who he actually is." Mike's face didn't change, didn't register the hit, but his left hand, still laced with his right in his lap, twitched once. A micro movement. The only physical evidence that he'd heard what she said, that some part of him wanted to respond, wanted to stand up, wanted to walk out, but he stayed, because walking out would have been the headline. Mike Tyson storms off set. Proof of volatility, proof of inability to handle difficult conversations, proof that Robin was right. Cos used to make Mike watch footage of his opponents, not to study their technique but to watch their eyes. The moment they start thinking instead of reacting, they're finished. The thinking gets them killed. Mike was thinking now, thinking about every conversation with Robin that had led to this moment, every time he'd tried to make her happy, every expensive gift, every apology for losing his temper, every time he'd believed her when she said she understood him, understood the damage in him, that she could handle it, that she loved him anyway. It had all been data collection, gathering evidence, building a case, and he'd helped her do it. Confessed his fears to her at 3 a.m, when he couldn't sleep, told her about the nightmares, about feeling like everyone wanted something from him, about not being sure if people loved him, or loved what he could do. She'd held him, told him it was okay to be vulnerable, and then she'd taken that vulnerability and turned it into a psychiatric diagnosis on national television. Barbara Walters was building to something. You could feel it in the room. The interview had a structure, and they were approaching the climax. Mike, Robin has suggested that you might benefit from professional help, therapy, treatment. What are your thoughts on that? This was the kill shot, because if Mike said no, he was refusing help, confirming he was dangerous and in denial. If he said yes, he was admitting he needed psychiatric intervention, confirming Robin's entire diagnosis. He was cornered. Checkmate. And for the first time in the entire interview, Mike Tyson's face changed. Not into anger, into something that looked almost like relief. Like he'd been waiting for permission to admit defeat. "Yeah, I probably should. I probably need that." Barbara nodded, sympathetic, professional. "And will you seek that help?" Mike looked at Robin. Robin looked back at him with an expression that was impossible to decode. Concern, vindication, pity. "I don't know," Mike said. "I honestly don't know." The interview ended 3 minutes later. Small talk. Pleasantries. Thank yous. The cameras stopped rolling. Robin stood up first, smoothed her dress, touched Barbara's arm. Warm, grateful. Mike stood slowly, like his legs had forgotten how to work. Nobody shook hands. Robin left first, her publicist appearing from somewhere to guide her out. Mike stood there for maybe 10 seconds, not moving, not speaking, just standing in the bright white lights that were already being turned off by technicians who were thinking about dinner. One of the camera operators, a guy who'd been doing this job for 20 years, would later tell people that he'd never seen anything like it. It was like watching someone get executed in slow motion, and the condemned man just sitting there helping them tie the knot. There's footage of Mike leaving the studio that night. Not official footage. Paparazzi, grainy, handheld, shot from across the street through scaffolding. He's walking to his car, alone. No entourage, no bodyguards. Just Mike Tyson in an expensive suit, walking like a man who'd forgotten where he parked. His hands are in his pockets. His head is down, and the thing that the footage captures, the thing that makes it almost unbearable to watch, is that he looks small. Mike Tyson, who'd spent his entire adult life making himself larger than life, looked like he'd been reduced to his actual dimensions. 5'10", 220 pounds, 22 years old, rich and famous and powerful and absolutely completely alone. The car was a Bentley, silver, worth more than most people's houses, but Mike walked past it twice before his driver had to get out and guide him to it. There's a moment in the footage, maybe 3 seconds long, where Mike stops on the sidewalk and just stands there. People are walking past him, yellow cabs honking, the city moving at its normal speed, and Mike Tyson is standing perfectly still in the middle of it all, like he's forgotten how to move forward, like the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other has become impossible. His driver says something. Mike doesn't respond, just eventually gets in the car. The door closes. The Bentley pulls away into Manhattan traffic, and that's the last image. Expensive car disappearing into the night, carrying a man who'd just learned that money and power and being the baddest man on the planet couldn't protect you from the person sleeping next to you. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Robin Givens walked away with somewhere between $8 and $10 million. The exact amount was never publicly disclosed. She gave interviews afterwards, sympathetic interviews, where she talked about how hard it had been, how scared she'd been, how she'd loved him but couldn't save him. Mike didn't give interviews, didn't defend himself, didn't explain, just went back to boxing, won his next 5 fights by knockout. Vicious, brutal knockouts. Opponents who stopped moving before the referee could stop the count. And in every post-fight interview, when reporters asked him about Robin, about the divorce, about that night on Barbara Walters, he'd give the same answer: "I don't think about it." Next question. But the footage from inside the studio, the official ABC footage that they only aired once, tells a different story. Because if you watch it closely, if you ignore Robin and ignore Barbara and just watch Mike's face during those 4 minutes, you can see the exact moment something breaks. It's not when Robin calls him manic depressive, not when she says she's living in hell. It's earlier, about 90 seconds in. Barbara asks Robin, "When did you realize the marriage was a mistake?" And Robin answers, "Probably on the honeymoon." And Mike's eyes, which had been focused on the middle distance, unfocused but present, go completely flat, empty, like someone turned off a light that had been barely flickering, and now there was just darkness. That's the look they should have frozen for the thumbnail. Not rage, not sadness, not even defeat, just that emptiness. The look of a man who just understood that everything he'd believed about love and loyalty and vulnerability was a fairy tale. That he'd been fighting in a ring where the rules didn't apply, where his strength was useless, where his violence was trapped inside him, eating him alive, where the woman he'd trusted with his brokenness had used that brokenness to break him further and profit from the wreckage. 20 million people watched that interview. Most of them felt sorry for Robin. Some felt sorry for Mike, but nobody understood what they'd actually witnessed. Not a marriage ending, a fighter learning that some battles can't be won with your hands. That some opponents know how to hurt you in places you didn't even know you could be hurt, and that sometimes the worst violence is the kind that happens under television lights, while you sit perfectly still and let yourself be destroyed, because fighting back would only prove you're the monster they said you were. Mike Tyson had been knocked down before, would be knocked down again, but that night in Barbara Walters' studio was different. That was the night he learned that the world outside the ring was more brutal than anything inside it, and that the person sleeping next to you could do more damage than any heavyweight champion in history. The cameras recorded everything. The breakdown, the confession, the capitulation. But they couldn't record what happened inside Mike Tyson's mind during those 4 minutes of silence. The rewriting of his understanding of trust, of love, of who he could be vulnerable with, and who was collecting ammunition. Nobody knows what happens to a man when he realizes he's been studied like a lab rat by someone who promised to love him. Nobody knows what that does to the architecture of his soul, but you can see it in his eyes. In that footage, In those 4 minutes, if you know what to look for, the moment the light goes out, the moment Mike Tyson stops being a man trying to love someone and becomes something colder, something that would never trust like that again. Something that learned the most important lesson of his life in the real world. The ref doesn't stop the fight when you're getting destroyed. You just have to sit there and take it and smile and nod and let them tell 20 million people that you're crazy. And maybe you start to wonder if they're right.